is a manual muscle testing demonstration for wrist flexion and wrist extension against gravity and gravity eliminated. For both manual muscle tests, we will prompt the patient to sit in a chair at a table and ensure the patient demonstrates good posture. For wrist flexion against gravity, the patient will start with her forearms supinated towards the end of the table to ensure her wrist can move through full range of motion. Instruct the patient to bend her wrist towards her. Be sure the patient's forearm is stabilized on the table. The therapist should also stabilize her proximal forearm. The therapist will then place 2 to 3 fingers over the heads of the metacarpals on the volar surface of her hand. The therapist will then instruct the patient by saying, "Do not let me pull your hand down," and then applies resistance towards extension. The therapist will then use her clinical reasoning to grade the strength of her flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, and flexor carpi ulnaris. If the patient is unable to move through full range of motion, the therapist would test the wrist flexion in a gravity-eliminated position by placing the client's forearm in neutral position, on or side down on the table. The therapist would then instruct the patient to move through wrist flexion by saying, "Try to bend your wrist forward." The therapist would then use her clinical reasoning to decide if she should apply minimal resistance and then grade accordingly. For wrist extension against gravity, the patient will start with her forearm pronated towards the end of the table to ensure her wrist can move through full range of motion. Instruct the patient to lift her wrist backwards as far as she can towards her. If the patient is able to go through full range of motion, stabilize the proximal forearm with one hand and then place 2 to 3 fingers on the dorsal side over her metacarpals. You would then instruct the client by saying, "Do not let me press you down," and apply resistance towards flexion. The therapist will then use her clinical reasoning to grade the strength of the client's extensor carpi radialis longus, extensor carpi radialis brevis, and extensor carpi ulnaris. If the patient is unable to move through full range of motion for wrist extension, the therapist would test wrist extension in a gravity-eliminated position by placing the client's forearm in neutral position, ulnar side down on the table. The therapist would then instruct the patient to move through wrist extension by saying, "Try to bend your wrist backwards." The therapist would then use her clinical reasoning to decide if she could apply minimal resistance and then grade accordingly.